Hello, everyone. Good morning. We're having a few little technical difficulties, which is why we're starting late here. But my name is Charlie Stott. I'm co-chair of AIASF's Committee on the Environment, also known as COTE. And this presentation is produced by COTE and co-presented by AIASF in collaboration with the Center for Architecture and Design. And today's presentation is titled The Carbon Question: What do interiors have to do with it? Today's presenters will take a deeper look into how interior renovations and products used have major impacts on global warming over time, and what tools are available to reduce the carbon intensity of the materials we select for interiors. We'll be joined in just a little bit by Suzanne Drake, Senior Designer with Rebel Architecture and Design, and Francis Yang, Associate with Arup here in San Francisco. We don't have slides quite yet, but we do have sponsors, and we'll just run through those slides real quick when they come up in a little bit. But we'd like to recognize our AIASF sustaining benefactors, as well as our AIASF sustaining sponsors who make programs just like this possible throughout the year. This program is also registered with AIACES for continuing professional education. Credit hours earned are also eligible for mandatory continuing education hours for zero net carbon design, which is a new program required by the California Architects Board for architecture license renewal starting in 2023. Today's course and learning outcomes will qualify for one learning unit of health, safety, welfare of the AIA continuing ed program, as well as 1 hour of ZNCD, that's Zero Net Carbon Design, mandatory continuing ed for California architect licensees. So a few Zoom housekeeping details. We would like to hear from you and get your questions during this program if you have any. So please feel free to start using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen at any time. We will do our best to consolidate some of the common questions you ask and provide responses throughout the conversation, or at the end, time permitting. The chat box is closed today so that we may communicate behind the scenes here, as well as broadcast relevant resources and messages out to you, the audience. This program is being recorded, and a link will be circulated to all registrants when that information becomes available. One last pitch, and we don't have I don't think we have the slides up yet on the screen, but today's program is all about the impacts and reduction of carbon in the work we do as designers. And one critical thing that architects and interior designers can do to continue improving their low carbon impact design work is to sign on to the AIA 2030 commitment. And if you could, looks like our slides are up. Suzanne, if you could just scroll forward to, I know it's about the 6th or 7th slide, it's the AIA 2030 slide right there. Perfect. So the AIA 2030 commitment is an actionable design strategy that gives designers a set of standards and goals for reaching net zero emissions in our designs, while it also allows us as designers to track progress along the way toward net zero carbon. And I really encourage everyone on the call today and sharing with your colleagues to become a 2030 signatory. You can go on their website, the link is shown here, and create a unique climate action plan for your firm that's tailored for your studio's size and expertise. And you can begin tracking your progress toward design excellence that we all want to achieve in our work. So I don't know if we need to go back through the slides, but why don't we just move forward? Let's just move forward, because I'd like to introduce you guys, because we're already 5 minutes late. So if you could just go to the one slide forward, Suzanne. Here are our two presenters today, and I'll introduce them both. Suzanne Drake is a senior designer with Rebel Architecture and Design, and she leads the studio's sustainability initiative. Suzanne's career as an interior designer has focused on commercial interiors with over 2 decades of experience in workplace, healthcare, and laboratory environments. She specializes in creating healthy environments and being the conduit for healthy materials knowledge sharing both in and out of the studio. Suzanne was instrumental in developing the precautionary list and has co-authored 3 installments of the Healthy Environments White Paper series. Our second speaker is Frances Yang. She's a licensed engineer who works, she wears many hats at Arup here in San Francisco, and she has gained extensive experience in nurturing projects towards lower carbon, more sustainable and healthier outcomes. Frances leads both the sustainable materials practice and the embodied carbon practice for Arup's Americas region. She has served as a board member of the Carbon Leadership Forum. She's been a technical reviewer of the Embodied Carbon Calculator, and she's currently vice chair of the Structural Engineers 2050 Commitment Program. So now, please provide a warm welcome to our guests. And I think, Suzanne, you're kicking it off. Is that right?
I am. Thank
Great.
you for that.
You guys go, and I'm going to mute and go away for a little bit. And
Thank you, Charlie.
do ask questions. Put your questions in the chat if you have them. Thanks.
Great. Sorry for the delay. Thank you, Charlie, for covering all the housekeeping stuff. So to cover for me. Thank you. So I just have set a little bit of context for this presentation. I've been in and around the sustainability movement in one way or another for a couple of decades now as an interior designer, mainly and mostly through the transparency and healthy materials effort. One thing I have observed is how deeply personal sustainability is. People don't usually come into the discussion because of this statistics. But at the same time, sustainability is, or really the lack of it is obviously a global phenomenon. So personal, and yet it's global at the same time. And as I've learned from deep diving into material ingredients with Frances and many others on the scene, molecules have a way of traveling around the globe, wreaking havoc wherever they go. And it's not just the toxic synthetic molecules, it's also carbon. That carbon is being released into the atmosphere at ever-growing rates, as you all are well aware of, throwing off the balance of our ecosystem that we call the climate. That's the global ecosystem, right? And once I know about this and all of those things that contribute to that, I can't unknow it. And I realize that I have to do things differently. And by things, I mean business, right? The business of design. So business as usual, the way that the things that we dream up and recommend to our clients to buy and to build, and the things that we specify, all of these things are part of the global problem of climate change. And when I think about this too much, it really makes my heart sink, because it makes me realize that I am part of this system that is the problem. But I'm just one person. How can I possibly do anything that makes a relevant difference? And it makes me just want to put my head into the sand. And then on the other hand, working in sustainability, in the sustainability realm as a professional can also be very challenging on its own, as I'm sure many of you have kind of become aware of. I mean, professional etiquette tells us to leave our heartstrings at the door, that it's unprofessional to have an emotional response to this business as usual. And yet, design and architecture, passion is an asset. People look to that for us. We talk about what inspires us, and having an emotional response to a design, to the finished environment, that is a mark of a job well done. So designers and architects, we live in this intersection between that public and the private realms, and we have stories to tell. So when those stories are compelling, they bring along our clients, but they also bring along the contractors and the manufacturers and the factories and the supply chains. And that is how it moves from being something very personal and emotional to being global. And that is how we make the change, and that is how one person can make a difference. And we certainly know now better than ever, right, about supply chains being truly global. So we're here to talk about some of the things that we can do differently right now. You're here because you already know in your heart that business as usual can't go on. and you're here because you've already lifted your head from the sand. And so for that, I thank you very much. And we will move on to our learning objectives. I'm just going to breeze over some of this stuff and hand this over to Frances, because we need to jump right into the carbon basics and make sure everybody's up to speed. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think that, yeah, I just love when you give that personal testimony, and it just reminds us of the, why we even care about this, and how you came to thinking about carbon and the impacts, those kinds of impacts of design. And so, really the whole point of what we want to bring to you today is just to equip you with some of the resources, and try to present it in a way that's a little more approachable. There's still a lot of information here, but we just want to present different entry points and see what is most compelling to you, and just start anywhere that you feel drawn to, and it'll lead you on a path in the same way it has for both Suzanne and I. Carbon basics. We're going to use some terminology, just getting everyone up to speed on it. I'm on the same page on it. So embodied carbon, it's really another term for greenhouse gas emissions that are particular to the making of materials, and delivery, and then the whole life cycle of materials, excluding the operational carbon part, especially the operational carbon of operating our buildings. Global warming potential is the more scientific term, and that's it's a measurement, a very specific measurement. That's what you'll find in documentation, but kind of colloquially, we refer to that as embodied carbon. So, why does this matter? I think the next slide, please. I think a lot of you have seen this pie chart that buildings, both when you combine both operational and embodied, it's a huge piece of this pie, and that we have influence over. Also thinking about where we need to get to. I think it's all kind of agreed now. There's a lot of consensus globally to get to zero by 2050. This is a somewhat older chart that SE 2050, or sorry, Architecture 2030 published a while ago. But what I really appreciated about this chart is the idea of a total amount of carbon emissions is what we need to limit. So while we say get to zero by 2050, it matters enormously how we get there. If it was just a straight line, that'd actually be too much emissions, and we would reach the tipping, we go over the tipping point. They've actually changed the chart now so that it's even more aggressive, and we have goals to get to zero by 2040. You can visit their site for the updated one, but I just appreciated that how we get there matters, and we need to the more we can accelerate quickly sooner, the more effective that we can turn the tide on this. So of course, this is all with in mind. Another thing working against us is how quickly we're building. Another statistic that Architecture 2030 has put out, by 2060, we will basically double the entire world building stock. That's just kind of mind-boggling. And then if we do think about, not necessarily how long, a lot of total carbon studies at both that operational and embodied, historic or in the past, people felt, oh, well, the embodied is small compared to the operational over the whole life of a building. But now, waking up and realizing we only have till 2050. Most of those, it's only like the next 30 years, not the whole life of our new building stock. And when you look at that shorter time frame and think about our new buildings, and even the ones that are meeting the goals, even both AIA and Architecture 2030 goals of reaching net zero operational, 50%, almost half, is coming from the materials, because those are there on day one already. So that was like a really unique way to start to look at the significance of embodied carbon. Again, thanks to Architecture 2030. And then, today we're really trying to bring attention to interiors because, again, looking back, there's been a lot of emphasis with doing things about the core and shell. Yes, that is part of the day one, this more significant portion, but we just, are reminded that interiors get redone so much more frequently, and that builds up, and over the lifetime of a building, it can equate to as much as the Carbon Leadership Forum has studied and shown in this graph. Yeah, then Suzanne, I think you had some commentary to add to this slide too.
Really just emphasizing, I think that the storyline coming out of the carbon research and carbon, in terms of operations versus embodied, for the longest time as an interior designer, all I was hearing about was the embodied carbon of the core and shell and how it was so massive, but I didn't see where interiors fit into that. And these more recent studies that pick up that obvious piece of the renovation portion of our industry that kind of closes the gap there to say, yeah, this is, everybody has to focus on this. Nobody gets a pass anymore. So we're all in it.
Right. And here, I just dropped a link to the actual study into the chat if people want to dig into it some more. So just also a little bit more on the basics, and we'll be through it. That notion of how do you actually quantify that carbon? It's what it is. It's using in a process and accounting called life cycle assessment, and it's really looking at what we extract from our planet in terms of resources and all of those extractions from nature, and then the emissions that we put back out. So carbon is just one of the metrics, and different methodologies have different sets of impact measures that they include, but pretty much all of them include embodied carbon or global warming potential. And so it's, over this whole life cycle of a building. You can also think of over the whole life cycle of a building product. And then the next slide shows the really popular scope terms. So when you're just talking about material extraction and then the manufacturing and production, that's termed cradle to gate, and what is represented in environmental product declarations, which is what we're going to get into next. And then you'll also hear the term cradle to grave, which is the full life cycle. Because a lot of manufacturers, they feel they don't have a lot of control over what happens after leaving their gate. A lot of them don't include that they're just cradle to gate. But we as the specifiers and selectors of these materials have to think about those the future life cycle phase impacts. Or some of them do try to include the cradle to grave, but you have to then be closely looking at their assumptions and seeing how they compare to what you would anticipate. So another just diagram to try to make sense of a lot of terminology that's out there. So we think of a single product. Again, we're going to dive into looking at some EPDs soon. Want to show what that does derive from. So you have that coming from that accounting method that we call life cycle assessment, and that actually that actually produces the report. And the report of results is the EPD, the environmental product declaration. But it has to follow some standards. There's ISO standards, and it has to follow what it's called a product category rules, which follow another ISO standard. So there's this process, a standardized process involved to get to the EPD, and that is to make for this notion that EPDs could be more comparable. And although it's not perfect yet, but that's the direction and the reason why we have all these standards that govern EPDs. Now, how that fits in with doing a whole building life cycle assessment, which you might have also heard about, that you can see how it's really doing the LCA is like the heavy lift. It's the expensive part, and that information it is what feeds into some of these tools or studies that people do to get it to capture the whole building and the environmental impacts of a whole building, and that LCA whole building LCAs also follow certain standards and will lead to a whole building LCA report. Usually, quite often now, there's tools actually customized for buildings to help us get to those results without having to be a complete like LCA expert. So, hopefully that kind of helps to differentiate when we look at single products and versus a whole building. And then speaking of the tools, so these would be the kinds of tools, especially for whole buildings. It's a really popular one called Tally that works off of rivet models. And there's also this database called Quartz, and which is more where you could download an Excel file. Quartz is, I should put a caveat, it's no longer supported. It was this great project funded by Google. But there is a bit of movement trying to away from that and into other tools, because it was also actually trying to provide health information, and there's other outlets for that now. And then Tally, there's other similar tools like Tally, but Tally is the one that can actually work within a rivet environment, which we think is a big plus. But there's also ones you might have heard of, like One Click LCA, Athena, particularly for has Canadian data, and it gets more specific geographically. Yeah, so there's quite a few whole building tools at one's disposal. I just wanted to give an example of use of Quartz in particular, because it felt like this would, was one result from a project recently that was very telling of the importance of interiors. So this is where, Quartz, it's generic information, so is the data in Tally. And it's really the usefulness we found was to identify the hotspots and see what it is we should tackle. So this, as I said, Tally is dependent on a rivet model, and realizing that a lot of interior designers, they don't necessarily get to be at the rivet model, especially not till later design. So we used Quartz with Rhino, and just based on surface areas that we could get a sense of, okay, well, we know approximately this much is going to be, the wallboard versus the panels, what kind of panels, ceiling panels, or flooring, what kinds of flooring. So we just assigned what we knew were the predominant materials, and it really struck us that the most opportunity was in some of these interior items, like the flooring and the metal ceiling panels. Similarly, actually, for commercial interiors, we were commissioned a study done by the Carbon Leadership Forum, and actually just before this, the Carbon Leadership Forum did a study, which was the link that I put in the chat, that was just focused again on the interiors items, and then this graph I thought was really helpful to again look at where are the hotspots, where are the systems that we should really put our attention to. And then from this, when we were working with WeWork, we turned this into what's either for a client that has a lot of really similar fit outs and brands and styles, or your own firm, right? Like if there's kind of a palette that you turn to repeatedly, that something like this could be developed where there's guidance for each of those, the top, you pick out the top tier of those high impact systems. So now we're getting into the EPD portion. This is just an example. It's a document. It can look like, it could be short, long. It comes in a lot of different appearances. right?
Yeah, sorry about that. It took me a minute to find my unmute. Yeah, so we have EPDs. What are they? They are the life cycle analysis. So it's basically a report. So there's not a standardization about the look of the report. The data can be kind of sprinkled throughout, but they do all have to report on the same types of things. So when we jump into the EPDs and look at them more closely, that's what we're going to focus on. Is like sorting through. It can be very daunting to look at some of these documents are tens, 10, 20, 30 pages long, and they are so dense with information. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time just highlighting the specific things that are like most useful off the top. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. But what I want to highlight here is what is not in an EPD. We don't have health impacts. That is covered under the Health Product Declaration, the HPD, which is basically meant to be like a companion document. I mean, ideally, every product would have both of these reports. That's not where we are right now, but I can just tell from my own use of HPDs and EPDs that generally speaking, lower toxic products also have lower carbon impacts in general. So that's a nice synergy to see. But we're going to spend just a couple more minutes on how you can use these documents to account for carbon on your projects. So
Yeah, and then before, thanks. Before Suzanne pulls up an EPD and gives you a tour of one, this is just to show you plant some seeds and ideas of how you might use an EPD. So in this case, there were a bunch of carpet options. There was a current carpet standard, and we were trying to see, okay, how would some other options compare? You could see that there's some that are using really high recycled content, some not as much, but still of the same material. And then this idea of converting completely to wool. Then there is also another study with another foreign product, the terrazzo, and what it would mean to the potential reduction in embodied carbon to switch to a bio-based epoxy or bio-based resin instead of epoxy for the terrazzo flooring. So what struck out, wasn't so much like, oh, this particular product was better than the other. It was some of the biggest takeaways, I think, were that particularly because we couldn't necessarily say that because the exact product that designers were considering didn't actually have an EPD. So we had to use these proxies of the closest published EPD. And so this was definitely like an early phase, kind of meant to be more directional and give us some lessons, realizing that the data wasn't exact. But yeah, some of the takeaways though were that the replacement, right? It goes back to that churn again. The replacement had more mattered more than that the product for product initial, like the cradle to gate impact. So products that could last longer, or that or things that might even be a little bit out of the control of how often does the facility tend to replace, and having any kind of influence on that, it actually would mean quite a bit. And then the bio-based material that was enormously better than the fossil fuel based kind of materials. So those are some of the takeaways, and then we'll show next where to find some of these EPDs. So on the left, or Suzanne, did you want to?
Oh, no, I was just going to jump in. Sustainability Minds Transparency Catalog has a great filtering capability. Is really useful if you're on a lead project and you're looking for those EPDs, and especially the ones that have been optimized. Same with HPDs. Mindful Materials is more of a general database. all the products that are in mindful materials have some form of transparency documentation. They may not have specifically an EPD, but there's other materials there. And if you're a material bank user, you can sort through via mindful materials as well. There's a nice connection there. EC3, Francis, maybe you can chat on that one. I don't use that one too often.
Yeah, EC3 is solely on EPDs, and it was originally designed for contractors, but it's become really handy. Even for design teams, you get to see the range of the GWP, that the embodied carbon number for a whole variety of products, and they have some charts that help synthesize the data, because they've digitized the information in the EPD. And I think that's really where all these tools need to trend, like to digitization. And I know that there's a lot of efforts with mindful materials to go that way as well.
And the last place to look would be the manufacturer's websites specifically. So if there's a manufacturer that you prefer using, start there, look under their sustainability tab. There's usually a shortcut to where you can find specific documents within their site. Obviously, they will have everything that is current and ready to go. So at this point in time, I want to jump out here and pull up some actual EPDs, and I'm having issues with my PDF, so you'll have to bear with me while I try to make this work. I have 3 to share. Oops, let's do that. Okay, and you all are seeing these. I just am having a hard time sorting between them. So I would like to start with the industry standard. So the industry, there's two kinds of EPDs. There's an industry average one, and then there's a product specific type, just very broadly. But like I said, all the EPDs should have the same kind of information. And so I'm going to just float through this. Let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger for you. We're just going to float through this one and kind of spot I'm going to say there's about 5 pieces of information that I kind of look for when I'm scanning through an EPD. So, and just a note, if you are pursuing LEED or any of the other rating systems that use EPDs, you're going to need other specific information, but this is more of an overview. So right off the bat, you want to see what is the product that the EPD is covering. So even if it's an average, it's not a specific product, it's going to be as specific as possible. Like this is specifically 5/8 inch type X board. It's not going to apply to 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch. It's 5/8 inch. Another really important item is the scope. So Francis mentioned those terms: cradle to gate, cradle to gate to gate, cradle to grave. Those are all different amounts of the life cycle of the individual product. So if you do have 2 EPDs, if any of these items are not matching up, they're going to be potentially wildly different and completely not be able to be used to compare together. So really need to know what the scope is. You need to know what that product is. It's useful to know if it's an industry average or product specific. The other thing that's useful to know is usually right near the front is how valid is it? Is it current? And also when was it issued? Because that's kind of telling you when the data came from. So the older that is, maybe the less useful it is. So it just gives you lots of information. On this one being an industry standard is telling you everybody who was involved, everybody's got to get their credit. A couple more items here, product category rules. This basically defines all of the terms that will be in their calculation. So again, if you're comparing documents, If they're not using the same PCRs, then the calculations are not going to be apples to apples at all. Then we have also the declared unit. And again, it's just like in math. If the units aren't in the same, aren't in the same type, then it's not going to make any sense. So the 5 categories I'm looking for: product name and type, scope, functional unit, validity we just talked about, and then hopefully somewhere in here you're going to see the actual global warming potential, and that's like the number that the whole document is wrapping up to. So there's lots of background data, there's lots of more information about the things we've already, the declared unit, all the details behind it. If I'm not familiar with the product type, this is actually fairly useful just to kind of see what all is typically in it. This is by no means as thorough as an HPD would be on ingredients, but it gives you an idea. They talk about their cradle to gate, the scope. They usually includes a diagram. This is the entire scope that could potentially be included, but as you can read in the diagram, they've only included cradle to gate. So it's from the ground to leaving the factory. So it leaves out a lot of stuff in this particular example. But, we can still scroll through. This is all to the backup data, more information about the rules, how they actually did their calculations. Usually there's a section called results or impacts, life cycle. You see those words together. You're getting close to the summary. And this is where we want to get that top number. So global warming potential in the kilograms per carbon dioxide equivalent, and it gives you a number. That's the sum total of what we've been looking for. And EPDs, besides the global warming potential, do include information on a lot of other aspects of environmental impacts, which can also be very interesting and informative. But as we were just talking about embodied carbon, that's the number that we're looking for. So continuing to scroll through, you see lots more data. There's a section, there's usually a section on interpretation that gives a little more breakdown. And actually, I think Frances has some good points to make about this. So I'll let her talk here in a second, but I just wanted to run through all of that. So then we get more into the definitions, and then there's going to be references, and that is the end. So this one was 23 pages, and it was an industry average. So I want to now just grab, why can't I get it? There it is. Let's get our specific one. I have 2 product specific drywall EPDs. And these are a little bit shorter, 12 pages from USG. They did the 5/8 inch sheetrock. You can kind of see they've organized this a little bit differently. Got your product information right at the top. There's the scope, there's that functional unit, and there's that magic number that we're looking for. And just a quick note, if you can remember back to high school science and math class, scientific notation, when you get to have lots of zeros, sometimes they go to scientific notation just so the number fits in the table. Positive numbers are more zeros, and the negative numbers are the zeros behind the decimal point. So just keeping that in mind. But all that same data is in here. Here's that PCR, the validity dates, the product. I'm just giving you that visual. Here's a different kind of diagram, but they're still telling you about how it's made. They are giving you all sorts of information, end of life, what to do with it. Usually all of this information is in most of the different EPDs, just maybe with slightly different titles and whatnot. So again, very useful in terms of understanding a product. This particular EPD is cradle to grave, which is a larger scope than the previous EPD that we looked at. It actually covers everything from coming out of the ground all the way to the end of life of the product. So it's a more comprehensive, I guess I'd say, EPD. And then here's our summary. Here's the basic categories. There's our global warming potential, all spelled out, and they've actually broken it down by stage. So in theory, if you had another product that only did cradle to gate, say, you could potentially still make a comparison. I think that was about it on this one. Again, with the interpretation section. And I'm just going to pull up onto the screen the last one. And then, Francis, I will let you highlight anything you want to look at. And we'll also, you guys, if you have any questions, now would be the time to get them into the chat. So here is the EcoSmart product, same size, same manufacturer, same scope, same declared unit. Here's that summary of the global warming potential. And it's, if you didn't remember from all those numbers flying by on your screen, this is lower number than their standard product. So this is really the ideal way to use it in terms of comparing two different products, that they're very specifically lining up against all those data points that we've been talking about. The declared product, the reference PCR is the same, even the date of issue and the period of validity is the same. And that's important because we know that the data is coming from around the same time. So there's probably not any differences in manufacturing changes or anything like that. Charlie's reminding me that we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to just leave it at that. And Francis, why don't you jump in? And anybody who has any questions about this, let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. I realize that there's a lot there. I think that, we're going to come to one of the biggest things that we can do is just to ask for these. Being able to compare product to product, I mean, it's really, if it's the same brand, like the two that Suzanne was showing, the same brand, and it's two different product lines, that's probably, and they're you double check, but they're most likely going to then be using the same PCR, check that the dates are quite near each other. That's probably the safest comparison to do between EPDs. Once you get into different manufacturers, definitely if you get into different PCR or dates that are really far apart, then that's where it starts to be much less comparable. And you're maybe just looking for order of magnitude, or even just like things about, especially in the interpretation, or if the one manufacturer is saying that their product is, they're doing things that their product is like so much better than their competitors, then it's like, show me the EPD, show me, and like and like, is it an order of magnitude, but like, is it significantly better, or is it just minutely? And then it just really, it's like all the seeds for a conversation with manufacturers, because I think that it's EPDs are useful. They're saying, okay, well, we want transparency. Show me the EPD, and that's where it's really not necessarily just that final number and how what percent. It's not so much what percentage difference it is compared to either the industry average or a competitor's product, but it's more like, tell me about how you made it and what it is you're doing that's but like at least improving upon yourself from each issuance, because these expire, and it's the 3 to 5 years is when we would hope manufacturers would make improvements in the way they make their products.
Okay, so everybody is absorbing this brilliantly. So I don't see any questions to go back to. So if something comes up, do bring it to our attention, but otherwise I'm just going to jump back in here and we'll just carry on.
Yeah, and we'll try to speed through this so there's a little time at the end too. So Just wanted to point out one other option with interiors, even better than trying to choose lowest carbon product is if you can reuse materials. This was a calculation done off of, again, some information from this Carbon Leadership Forum. But if I could encourage people to also think about reuse, particularly, I mean, I think there's some low-hanging fruit with like bathroom partitions and furniture and workstations and or equipment, even, you know, before getting to potentially the ceiling tiles or flooring. I think there's definitely some low-hanging fruit that we could be thinking about for or doors would be a big one. So I'm going to drop in another link. There's an all for reuse initiative that I've been a part of that might also be helpful for resources and what's available locally to you to get involved with that or to think about that more. Yeah, and then I think the last kind of concept that we wanted to really share that's related to reducing embodied carbon in interiors is the notion that, you know, building materials and buildings don't necessarily need to be a source of carbon emissions. That because there's building materials that can in the growing or even other technologies that sequester carbon, that absorb carbon or CO2 in making the material, that building materials are uniquely a place within, you know, the entire building and its life cycle to be a carbon sink, right? So that we could actually be drawing down carbon in the choices of what we put in our buildings. Yeah, so this was really to remind us that, you know, while there's a lot of information here, putting into practice, it really starts with the ask. So asking for transparency, this is just hand in hand with health and other things we want to know about building products. You know, in the same way that we've been asking more for material health information, we want to ask more about products and where they come from and how they're made to understand their impact on carbon as well, on the climate. Along the lines of putting into practice some things that, you know, so we as a designer specifiers as a community, or, you know, while we're pushing through that ask, there is a pull that's happening too through policy. And in California, in particular, there's quite a lot. I actually had to only take a snippet here. I'd encourage you to again visit. This is coming from the Carbon Leadership Forum website, and I can put in the more direct link later. But we have the BioClean California Act, and it covers kind of some of the major core and shell materials. But there was this huge effort just last year to introduce parallel acts to address finished materials and to ask for product-specific EPDs. Unfortunately, it did not pass. But that's where groups like the AIA California and Summit that is trying to act more at that statewide level, you know, more support from other, you know, designers and architects and interior designers could really help to gain more support and actually have some of this come through.
Yeah, and I can say as an interior designer, I wouldn't have thought that I could have much impact on the state level legislation, but they really, really respond to hearing from people who are doing the work. So anybody related to the field that's not even manufacturers, but like just saying, I'm an architect in California, or I'm an interior designer in California, and this is what we want, this is what our clients are asking for, carries huge weight with in getting these legislation even to the floor for a vote and passing it and all of that stuff. So I highly encourage you to get involved. It's kind of an interesting process. But carrying on.
Yeah, definitely, like maybe outside of what you consider the normal scope of of a designer, but really like to get to where we need to be, and that it's quite daunting sometimes to think like, how do we get to zero by 2050? But it's going to take everyone, and the more that we could be working together, and the policy gets design support, design gets policy support, it's this, it'll really help accelerate. This is a slide that we're hoping will help summarize some of the green building certifications and where interiors fit in. Let's not dwell on this too long. You can have these slides later. We will really want to jump to is the pledge. So this is the AIA's material pledge. And Charlie mentioned the 2030 commitment, which is enormous. It's huge for the whole building. Started to include embodied alongside operational for reporting on projects. This one we wanted to also point to because we think it's maybe more relevant for day to day and your what you're doing in with materials. So these two pledges are really kind of like sister pledges. There's one that came out for interior design through IADA and others, and then the other one was from the AIA. So I'll make sure to drop those links in too.
And really that kind of is the end of our talk. Here's some resources that we talked about. I did see one question in the chat that I wanted to get to because it's asking me specifically, do I have a tangible example of how we've used EPDs to make decisions on products on a project? And I'm going to be very honest, and I'm going to have to say no, because number one, the type of projects that I'm typically involved with are more around tenant fit outs. They're the quick churn landlord projects. They're the smaller client tenants moving into buildings. And while a lot of our clients we've seen a definite increase in our clients asking us about sustainability and putting sustainability goals in their RFPs, it's still not at the level where I think at this point in time, I actually just think that the clients just know what words they should be saying and what things they should be asking about, but they don't know how to require that. And the other side of that is with interior products, while there's a lot of EPDs out available, there's not necessarily enough of enough of the same type to really make those comparison decisions. So, and I think that's just due to not quite enough EPDs like reaching a critical mass. And I kind of feel like it's very similar to when we had HPDs first rolling out and there were a smattering, and you wanted to bring the most healthy materials you could to a project, but so many products just didn't even have one, you couldn't evaluate them. So I will say that I feel like it's increasing a lot more rapidly, and there's a lot of resources out there like that, as we've mentioned, but I think where they are still very useful is going to be more at that early stage. Some of the case studies that Francis mentioned where you're just kind of directionally like, should I go towards this type of flooring or this type of flooring, just at a broad generic level and not at that specific level where I kind of live as a fast churning, fast moving project designer. I hope that answered your question. And then another,
just add that,
yeah,
and I think it might actually help with the second question too. I think we've been privileged to have some clients that really were supportive of us using LCAs and EPDs. That some of the fastest things, even when the client isn't asking, I think are those, especially those 3 tools that we had provided. That with EC3, like there's not as many product categories, but for the ones that there are, you can get a quick view of, like, you can sort by the global warming potential and see, oh, okay, amongst these manufacturers, these are the product lines that are lower, and then which manufacturers even just have more EPDs. Within Steel Mines, there's like a little bar. They actually work with EC3. There's this little bar that also tries to indicate that like the deeper the green color is like an indication of on the EPD column for when products that have lower. And then Mindful Materials is also working really hard to not only just digitize, but you can also go to the CSI categories and look and in complement with optimized EPDs, which is like not just transparency, but actually trying to do something better. Then you can look at a lot of these other sustainable material attributes, these other categories that in simultaneously for the VOC certifications and the so those are just three of the tools. In addition to asking your go-to reps. Like,
yes, what I want to start implementing on projects at our firm, and I'm not quite there yet, but this is something I've been thinking about for a while, is on a finish schedule. We already do implement that we have to require that every product that we are specifying has some sort of transparency document. And what I'd like to start adding is a column for what is the GWP, what is the global warming potential. So in a lot of cases, that might just be a dash because we don't know, because there's not an EPD. But where there are, we can start filling them in. And I think what that does is give us as designers a baseline. We start to get used to expecting a certain number for certain product types. And so when we start to see, like, it's just kind of getting familiar with the language of embodied carbon. It's just another aspect, another data point that I want to become part of our language, so that we can start. I mean, it's just a place to start in order to go towards optimizing it as more and more EPDs become available. So we'll see how that works out. We have another question. Do you know if generally manufacturers are willing to put out these reports if you ask them? So an EPD is a life cycle analysis of a product. So it's actually a pretty big undertaking, I think, for most manufacturers. And I think if you asked for one, if you had a big enough project, then they might be more motivated to create one if they don't have one. But there is that barrier of just gathering the data and running it through their lawyers. And
well, it seems like, if they had enough customers asking, right? Like, and then definitely, especially if you're working with an owner where that product is part of their palette and like it's their brand standard, they deploy it in multiple facilities. That I think those are probably the most effective motivators. But also what, in terms of time, it does take time. And what we've done in our specs is to say that an EPD must be produced within either like 12 months or 18 months of award, so that they have the time to produce it. It does take 1 year's worth of operational energy information from the plant. So if they don't already have, so it's easiest, they should be able to produce it much easier if they already have an EPD. It's just not for that specific product. But if it's something they have to start from scratch, then that can be challenging, and we want to build that time in to the request.
So I think we have carried over our time by a couple minutes, so I'll hand it back to Charlie. Thank you.
Well, we could go on, I'm sure. I don't think there are any more questions though. I'm happy to answer more, but it looks like we've answered all of them as well as we can. And this has been super informative. I think it could have been more than an hour because there's a lot of detail here. And I won't go on with any of my own questions, but thank you everyone for attending today. And thank you, Suzanne and Francis, for joining us. We do have to continue this conversation though. I think it's really important. And maybe there's another one that's just purely on EPD. And I think the questions about how do you get this into your documentation and a part of your design process would be really, I think, fruitful for a lot of our listeners. So I think we have to end it on that note, and I thank you all, and we'll be back again for another episode of COTE, some of these COTE presentations in the future. So thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.